for our next talk, we're going to switch to the European level. And actually, this is something that our members have really demanded from us when we were curating this program, and we were giving our members some proposals. Yeah, we could have some talks about this subject or that subject, and we also proposed to have a talk about legislative initiatives on the European level. There was overwhelming demand from our members. Yes, please. We want to hear something about this. There's huge interest, and that's because many of our members this year have been following very closely the political discussions around the Cyber Resilience Act. Peter has mentioned this earlier. This was a huge subject for our members, and this has been something on our plates for the past weeks and months. And other initiatives like the AI Act or also the Product Liability Directive, they are just as impactful for everyone who is doing business in the European Union. And that's why in this next talk we want to shed some light onto the question why policy making in Brussels matters to everyone, why it matters so much, and why it also impacts the open source ecosystem, and especially how people active in the open source ecosystem, how they can represent their interests and how they can make their voices heard. And we have just the right speaker for this. Astor Nummelin Carlberg is the executive director at the OpenForum Europe, who have been very, very active around the Cyber Resilience Act, and we thank them for this very much. And Astor is also on the board of Appel, that's the European umbrella organization for the European open source business associations. Astor has plenty of experience when it comes to policy making in Brussels and advocating for the open source ecosystem. We are very excited to learn about your insights now, and the floor is yours. Please welcome Astor with a warm round of applause. Thank you, Astor. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. So let me just spontaneously add something. This index stuff is incredibly important. It is the kind of top dream of what we would like to see at the European level. So I would say support and engage. It's perhaps like the gold standard of what we have recommended over the last 20 years. But maybe that's something we can discuss further later. So good afternoon. My name is Astor Nummelin Carlberg, and as Miriam said, I'm the Executive Director of OpenForum Europe. So I'm very happy to be here at the Open Source Day in Berlin. I haven't been in Berlin for a while, and it is a city that I called home for half a year, but many years ago. So I must confess my German language proficiency is kind of contingent on a few beers, so maybe you'll hear me speak German later. Unfortunately, not now. And so I will share my view on what I think are the critical dynamics of shaping software in Europe and in the world right now, and what that has to do with policymaking. I will leave as much time as I can for a Q&A, because I suspect there are some questions and maybe concerns that are quite specific around the CRA, PLD, AI Act. And instead of me just guessing what you want to know exactly, I think giving some space for exact questions will help. But I'll get into some parts. But I'll try to make a bigger point as well of why engagement long-term matters, and why we have to deal with something like the CRA and PLD right now. So first of all, let me then introduce OpenForum Europe for those who don't know this organization. For the last 22 years, OFE has worked with the politics of open technologies. So we do more than open source, but it's quite a lot of open source. And here, open source is, of course, an approach to innovation. It's a social system, a question of user and individual freedom and rights. It's a bunch of code, and it's a collection of very, very diverse institutions and organizations collaborating, and a large group of not as diverse engineers and experts collaborating. But also, as open source is a subset of intellectual property, and intellectual property only exists because of government action, open source is inherently political. And I think that is important, especially for this group, to consider. Your industry is more political than other industries. So OFE was founded in England, but we quickly understood that the key policy decisions relating to open technologies happen in Brussels. So a research and policy team was set up there. And then after Brexit, we cut the cord completely with the UK, as they cut the cord with us. So now we are a Belgian not-for-profit. One important thing here is that we're not a trade association, so we're not like the OSBA. But we work a lot with trade associations, and the OSBA is one of our key partners. I see you as a point of reference of how open source business interests can be organized, represented, and communicated. Just this kind of meeting that we saw today, it stands out in Europe, it stands out in the world. This is good work. Not always super fun, but this structure is incredibly important. So now I'll try to bring you into the political theaters that I try to make a little bit of a dent in and influence with my team and our partners. And I will talk about the new rules for software and how they are being structured and who writes them. And hopefully I'll be able to offer some insights and ideas for actions that are a bit more tangible than my big grand ideas that I have around the software market development in the next 5, 10, 20 years. So here on the slide you see 6 policy developments that I think matter. Colored green, for good. I put the Interoperable Europe Act, which is a file that's received, unfortunately, a lot less attention than it should, mostly because of the CRA. It's a very positive act. I also put the construction and networking of open source program offices in the public sector across Europe, but not only in the public sector. We also see a lot of traditional economic verticals and industries starting to build OSPOs and invest in open source competence. I've also added the increased interest and sophistication of government funding into the open source ecosystem. Here I put the Next Generation Internet Program and the German government Sovereign Tech Fund. All of these are worthy their own presentations, but here I also just really want to underscore this positive side, because of course I'll paint a bit of a bleak picture with some of the other ones. These, like the OSPOs, Interoperable Europe Act investments, and many other efforts that are happening across Europe, the numbers of hours of policy work and advocacy that has been put in to make European governments comfortable to take these steps, I think this is often understated. And it's many of you in this room that have played central roles in making this happen. So both in Berlin and Brussels. Keep in mind that just a few kilometers, maybe, I don't know how far it is to the government buildings actually, but from here, as much European and EU policy is decided as in Brussels. Politics in Germany is European politics. So, but more important, the red part, the bad part to catch your attention, the CRA, PLD, and the AI Act. Now, they have been mentioned, but it is also, of course, an oversimplification to just say that these are good or bad. The intent with these new liability and responsibility regulations for the software market are often laudable and positive. And I don't mean this as just a politically correct talking point to be nice to the European Commission. We need more cybersecurity, and the tools that we have in place are liability and capacity building efforts in industries. This is nothing new to any market vertical, and it's not new to open source companies either. And as I said, really keep your questions that are specific on the CRA and PLD that I might answer. I should say that our top expert is currently in Madrid talking to the Spanish presidency of the EU, so we can always follow up with more answers. But just a quick update on the general state of play. So first of all, these ambitious laws are being developed, negotiated, and finalized under a time pressure that are very new to us. We have never dealt with this kind of quick of negotiations for something this dramatic of a change. So it's not just the speed, it's also that it happens while maybe 8 or 10 important legislative files are happening at the same time. This is a strategic choice by the European Commission, and I think inherently it's a smart one. If you want to regulate the digital markets, overwhelm them. It's not just hard for the open source ecosystem to follow this, I can tell you. I've heard the same thing from representatives of the biggest companies in the world. As a general point too, with the CRA and PLD especially, but AI Act also, we started with something. Already in the proposed law, there was language referring to free and open source software. But this language didn't manage to sort out our concerns, to put it mildly. It showed a fundamental misunderstanding of open source and the relationship between the different stakeholders in the very different ecosystems and projects. Traditional liability regulation didn't really fit so nicely with open source. Things are being done differently in the software world. For the CRA more specifically, the thing that stood out for us, but perhaps for anyone who looked at the CRA with open source eyes, was recital 10. So it explicitly deals with free and open source software. Maybe an interesting side note is that the CRA mostly regulates open source because software is mostly open source. And it was dealt with one recital, not even an article. But sorry, I'm not here to sound too bitter. Now, a lot of stakeholders have been active, and the negotiations are, from the text we're seeing, are going in the right direction. But for open source companies, the ones you're representing here today, expect to be dealt with as software companies in general. Look at the annexes, get into this file. You will be regulated. If you make money from software products, the CRA will hit you. We are not, as OFE, working with that. We are working at an ecosystem level. We're not a trade association, remember? OSBA, Appel have taken a slightly different position, a very important one. But keep in mind, regulation is coming, so very much get into this file. But I believe that probably your first instinct here is to look at the direct impact on your companies that will come from these regulations. This makes sense, and you should do this. But I would like to ask you to keep kind of additional things in mind at the same time. Firstly, even if we're managing to sort out some key issues, I believe that the effect of the CRA and PLD and AI Act will be the greatest at the ecosystem level, and it will have some delayed effects. In Europe, we want more open source to be created and shared, not less. And these regulations are very likely to be kind of a cooling effect on, let's say, think of the big industrial companies that we're trying to encourage to engage more in the open source ecosystem. Large companies don't like liability risk. And the second thing to keep in mind, and to me, as a representative of OFE and what we work with, it's perhaps the most important question to consider, even now before the dust is settled with the CRA. And that is, how did we end up here? Why did open source software development end up as an unintended casualty? Now, I have maybe 3 different examples of this. Political processes are difficult to untangle and follow sometimes. I think a famous German once said that it's how sausage is made. And it's kind of hard to kind of pick out exactly how something happened, but there's something that stands out for me. One is the fact that it's all based on the new legislative framework. I'm not going to bore you too much with what this is exactly, but essentially there's 30 years of product liability regulation in the EU that upholds the single market. It is very difficult to make the argument that open source is different. This is a big lift. We have 30 years of legislative history, and where a lot of verticals, economies, and markets resting on these. At perhaps a smaller level, it is fascinating to us I sound so bitter here. But the European Commission built an open source program office. They were never consulted in how open source should be regulated in this file. That could perhaps be something they should look into in the future. Now, on the surface, I feel like as Europeans, we are following a political discourse that promises a digitally secure and innovative Europe. I think this is true. I'm not against the regulation here. I would prefer to not complain so much about the CRA and do other things that really kind of use the power of open source instead of kind of working against it. But at the same time, beneath these different regulatory processes and these laws, I think if you take a few steps back and look at it, we are seeing a seismic shift in the fundamental rules governing how software is being done and how software can be used. I think that we really need to deeply understand why open source became an unintended casualty in order to know what we do next. Because when the new rules are set, and by the new rules I mean the liability regulations, but I also mean the building of open source program offices in governments, the interactions with standards bodies that will create the certifications and standards that the software industry will have to rely upon. These new institutions will set the winners, set the rules that will decide the winners and losers for the next 20 years. And I think it will determine the open versus closed contest that has been going on for the last 20. But let me get even more dramatic. We are entering into a new era, anyone who deals with software. Similar to all other historical patterns in technology and technology regulation, we're seeing this current cycle that we're in now concluding. And these new regulations are literally just a sign of where we're heading. And none of this is new. We've seen these cycles before, and we need to learn from history. We cannot just look forward anymore. We need to bring in those dusty regulatory history books. How was the ITU built in the 1800s? But for this, another pressing question remains. Who will write these new rules? And as we, or you as a software industry, progress from a phase of free innovation and one of structured regulation, the power dynamics are shifting. The landscape will be redrawn, and it's crucial to consider who else will be there, because these institutions and groups are being built. Will it be the current market leaders that write these rules, or the governments, or a combination of the two? Because from an open source perspective, we have to ask ourselves, how can open source be adequately represented? Who will do it for us? Will we do it? Who speaks for open source? These are difficult questions to really figure out. I want to underscore, OFE never claims to speak for open source, but we know a lot of people in open source. So, how do we make sure that the people who sit around the rooms writing the new rules consider the essence of open source, understand the essence of open source, or at least don't fundamentally misunderstand it? With the CRA and PLD experience fresh in mind, do you think we as part of the open source community has done enough? Have we taken things seriously enough to even explain the basics? Do politicians understand the fragile social contract of reciprocity and the unprecedented value chain that open source has created? How big it is in the real world? So you, as open source businesses, you must broaden your perspective. While we work and deal with the CRA PLD, both in the last few weeks of negotiations and also the implementation period and your internal policies dealing with these new liabilities, start looking towards the establishment of a robust EU-wide or even international institutions that can deal with open source. We need to create the middleware, the interface through which open source can deal with governments and how governments can deal with open source. So I understand that this is not easy to do as an SME that works quarter to quarter. I mean, just to do some policy work, showing up to OSBA meetings, this is an investment. Don't get me wrong, this is already something. But Europe's open source industry is built up by a myriad of software companies. They're small, and there is a collective action challenge that you simply have to solve in order to be part of the conversations in the future. Otherwise, you are not there when the new rules are being written. So what can you do? Financial contributions. As members of OSBA, next time you have this meeting, tell them to increase the membership fees even further. 5% is not enough. Invest. If you want to work for the long term and invest in the future, come talk to us, obviously, but you can start with OSBA. So why money? Well, we need to ensure, for example, that the policy field is professional and sustainable. The time when volunteers could carry the burden of policy work has long passed. And that is why we have the CRA and the PLD. Policy professionals must be able to build lasting careers, train younger people to come in, and really be experts across Europe. We have 27 member states. And this investment in human capital will shape a resilient and equitable future for open source policy. And if done right, we will be at the table when the new rules are written. If we do this really well, we invite the governments to our table. But this is to some extent very defensive. I think that the best way we can move forward and secure a future for open source and open collaboration in the next era of software is to tell the big and positive story. It's time for us to build our own institutions. Let's build up OSBA and Appel. Let's go beyond that. Let's go global. We need these vehicles to explain to leaders across Europe and the world that by embracing open source, we empower all societal stakeholders to collaboratively tackle our most pressing strategic challenges. From climate change, digital market concentration, inclusive economic growth. Open source is this catalyst for innovation and at the same time a means to secure a sovereign digital future for Europe. And so together, not just open source companies, but the many other stakeholders in the open source ecosystem that appreciate this, we have the opportunity now to harness this open collaborative force together with other societal stakeholders outside of the direct open source ecosystem to work together to ensure that Europe remains at the forefront of technological progress, strengthened by our diversity, not weakened by it. So it is around here where we need to increase our ambition levels. Open source is collaboration done right. It is the collaboration that has created the most advanced and complex system in the history of mankind. Tell that story and tell how this can be used to solve the other problems and challenges that we have as a society. Because open source will have a role to play in all of them and all of their solutions. So it's time for us to turn all those collective challenges into a shared success. And with that, thank you very much, and I will hope that I left some time for some questions, and I'm leaving this slide because maybe that will spark some questions. Thank you very much.
Gibt's Fragen? Are there any questions in the audience? Questions, comments?
You can ask it in German, and I'll try.
Expressions of excitement. Yeah.
Yes, this last slide provoked my question. So, what do you think CRA 1.0? When will it come, and how harmful will it be to open source software? And do you really expect a CRA 2.0 to come quite soon to fix all those problems?
This is recorded, right? And it's always dangerous to make predictions on record. So how soon will the CRA come? Everything's still up for negotiation. Tomorrow, I believe, is a trialogue meeting where the free and open source question will specifically be discussed. My colleagues and many others, including Miriam, are very busy preparing for this. In terms of timelines, it could be agreed in a week. It could be blocked, and then it rolls over to the next mandate. You know, the European elections coming up in the spring. I would count on the CRA passing because of the political pressure on it to pass. But who knows? And then in terms of implementation, there are two things. I'm kind of oversimplifying here, but two things to keep an eye on. On the one hand, it's in kind of the last paragraph of the law. It will outline the implementation period. There are discussions between 36 and 48 months, etc. We'll see where it lands. It's one of the things being negotiated. But parallel to this, and this has already started, and we're part of some conversations at OFE, also in the European Commission at OFE, and that is the CRA standardization requests have been published. So standards in this context is the kind of granular translation of the CRA into the standards that need to be upheld. These standards will be developed by CEN-CENELEC, which is one of the European standards organizations. Sorry, this gets quite technical. But that is a place to engage and be a very, let's say, trusted and constructive partner. Most of the company and country representatives, that line is a bit fuzzy in the standards organizations, will appreciate the importance of open source, but they might not be open source experts. Find ways of talking to your government, talk to DIN, offer your support. The devil's in the detail with a lot of these files. And if there's something on this, maybe I can see if there's another question. We can get into future revisions and me theorizing widely of what might happen.
Yes, well, are there any further questions in the audience at this point in time? I mean, oh yeah, Peter.
Yeah, maybe a comment and a question. So first of all, thanks a lot. That was actually the intention to tell also our members and our guests how important it is to engage on the European level, because we will see more regulation, and if we are not careful, it might really hurt the development of open source, the free development by free individuals and organizations of open source. We had this discussion with CRA, and it might also hurt our businesses, and we need to be careful there. And the question is, you mentioned that, you said open source software might be a casualty of the CRA, but I'm not sure if everybody really understands in this room in which way it is becoming a casualty and why it is becoming a casualty and what the consequences might be. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yes, absolutely. But I should also say that You have Miriam at OSBA, who knows this file really well. If you're a software company, you put software products and services on the market. And when you do that, when the CRA is in place, a number of responsibilities of how to take care of this software, and to some extent with the Product Liability Directive, and this is why this is an important file to take a look at as well, you actually have liability. If something goes wrong, let's say you take in some source code into your product and there's an issue, something bad happens, you are the company that put it on the market and you hold the liability. Now, that is from the company perspective, and I'm pretty sure that Miriam can add a lot more detail in terms of the long lists of responsibilities and the relationship with the CE marking that comes with this, etc. But at an ecosystem level, and this is the kind of indirect effect that you really need to consider, is what putting something or placing something on the market exactly means is not super clear in the context of open source. If you're a developer at home just releasing some software, in the original proposal of the CRA, and together with the PLD, you would be liable for this. Whoever picked up and used it. You put it on the market. It was not linked, there was no, let's say, logic in where, let's say, profit flows in the market and where the liability fell. Open source foundations, big and small, they would be liable. Put out a binary, you put it on the market. And now that meant that projects were essentially regulated. So imagine this doesn't happen in the real world, but this is perhaps what some policymakers thought happened. You have one company that develops all the software internally and then places it at one point in time on the market. Fine. Now, I don't know any software companies that actually write all their code internally and just put it on the market. But if you contrast that to open source, where it's hundreds, sometimes maybe 1,000 times where it's being put on the market, that signals just how much heavier the regulatory burden would be for anyone working with open source in whatever capacity. So that is where there was this complete mismatch between just how software is being developed today and when it met the 30-year tradition of product liability regulation in Europe.
And just to add to that, if you want to learn more about this, we as Open Source Business Alliance, we have put out a position paper on the Cyber Resilience Act. It's on our website in German and in English. And we also published like a guest article in the Tagesspiegel background together with Bitkom under the title, The CRA Has Not Understood the Open Source Ecosystem. So we put some details and some examples in these papers. You can look them up. There was one more question I see.
Hi, Astor. Thank you for introducing that topic and your perspective on that. I'm Michael from Red Hat. You had a slide, will open source have a voice when the rules of software are defined? Now, my question is on the complexity of software and providing digital services and digitalization in general. Should we start talking about open source and the complexity of the model? Because I'm wondering whether the voice will be understood given the complexity of digitalization today. And I think we also need to protect software to a certain extent with the knowledge we have. And I think that my understanding on that background legal framework is very consumer driven, and they're not understanding the complexity of using software, providing infrastructure and digital services. And what is a service, and then also talking about applications in a world where we have very complex supply chains. Yeah. Aren't there pictures like the digital commons and the social aspect, something that is maybe better understood? Do you have ideas how we can hook the complexity of what open source means and the capabilities into a fairy tale that's better understood before we dive into the complexities? I see lots as technocratic stuff, but I think there are lots of emotions and feelings behind that. How is this fitting together from your perspective?
Yeah, I'm going to try to. It's very good points, and this is essentially what we sit and discuss and trying to figure out at our think tank. Now, do we have an answer? Not really, but let me first say, before I felt I sounded so doom and gloomy now with the CRA and PLD, things are moving. There's a lot of good arguments being put forward by different open source stakeholders, and the file is changing as we speak. There are many different outcomes, and things might change in different directions. So we have the policymakers and the politicians' attention. It has been stated several times in the media that the CRA, everyone agrees with it, except for one bit, and it's the free and open source software part. So it seems like the policy work has had some effect. But to your point on complexity and how to kind of communicate this complexity, well, I have kind of two contradicting views on this. The first thing is all engineers think that what they're doing is very, very complex and more complex than the other engineers' stuff. It's, from a political point of view, not so complex. It is also an ecosystem of social interactions. And I think that maybe software engineers and software companies have made them, done themselves a disservice by framing what they're doing as so incredibly complex, not welcomed other societal stakeholders and politicians in to understand what is being done. Because it was really nice not to have that tension of policymakers and politicians for years. Because, well, free collaboration, we can do a lot of exciting things. And then we get the CRA and PLD. This could have been done better, I believe. There is also blame to go around in the software world. But in terms of understanding and appreciating, one of the kind of key goals I would have from an open source point of view, and I'm sorry, I will sound a bit abstract here, but this is kind of my guiding light in the policy world. Most politicians, whatever side of the political spectrum they're on, if you ask them, are SMEs important? They will say yes. Do they know how SMEs are run? There are so many different kinds, and they've probably never run a small company themselves, but they know it's important. And that might be the goal, that we have politicians that understand that open source is important. It is important in the way, the environment is important, climate is important, because open source is the environment within which all digital things are being built. Small and large companies are built in the ecosystem of open source. It's part of everything. It is the environment now. And currently it feels a little bit like the politicians are looking at ways of regulating the forest because people are building bad houses. And sorry, I'm mixing metaphors here. But this point of really, I think sometimes it's also, I'm really saying bad things about engineers here, but engineers tend to think that if you explain properly with a really good argument, they will understand and then appreciate my world. Well, people are busy. So maybe set the goal of really just finding a way of increasing the appreciation that it is important, and don't expect deep understanding. Those don't have to come together. Then if we get them to understand completely, that's even better, because politicians that understand open source tend to appreciate it as well.
Thank you very much for that answer. I have seen 2 additional hands going up, but seeing as we have already gone vastly over time, it's not your fault, Astor, it's because we have started much later. I would actually give the last questions to Lothar, and I have seen the other 2 questions, but I hope for your understanding. I mean, you can catch Astor later.
I'll be here.
You're gonna stick around, and after a few beers, you can even ask him in German, and he will answer in German. So maybe that's even more exciting.
It will be a nightmare answer.
Well, let that up. The decision is up to them if it's a nightmare or no. Now we come to the last question from Lothar.
Thank you, Astor. Perhaps also a question for beer or something like this. It's the 1 million, or should I say 1 billion euro question. You mentioned that the understanding of the open source business is becoming better by politicians. I contradict a little bit to this. In my experience over the last 10 years or maybe 20 years, we experienced permanently a start by zero of the understanding. So often made the experience that we engaged, get the answer, oh, sorry, that was not what we should attended to open source business. Now the question, what do you think should we do different to now to get not this cycle starting every new regulation by zero, to explain that what they do is harming open source business?
In some ways, like what not to do. Well, I think it's a time now when we have to be a bit more pragmatic and perhaps a bit more cynical. Open source is many, many different things. My wife asked me, like, what is open source policy? And I tried to explain, and it became a very long explanation of like, here are the foundations. And yes, they're made up mostly of members of the largest companies, but then you also have the kind of public procurement discussion and the general procurement and like it's everything. It's, and I think for any trade association like OSBA, with your interests as members, also look for partners, collaborators that you're usually not working with. Those that you sometimes fight, tooth and nail. In some questions, you will have to work together and really be pragmatic and not ideological. I think that is at least a good place to start. Now, I also think don't necessarily look at, because I really pressed on the human capital point of view. Part of OFE's mission, and this is, my board tasks me with this, is that we train young people in open source policy so they can go elsewhere. Invest in this. I think Miriam and I know every single person who works on open source policy full-time in Europe. We know each other by first names. We have each other on WhatsApp.
Well,
yes,
I
Miriam.
that I'm on WhatsApp.
That's true. I actually tried to reach Miriam.
Drop me an email.
I have WhatsApp. Because that's true. The politicians have WhatsApp as well. No, but it's true. The point here is we need more people. We need feet on the ground. We need bigger organizations. Berlin needs 3 more Miriams that work for Miriam. Germany is complex. The EU is complex. Just that would be the place to start. Start investing in the human capital and training of these people. And don't necessarily look into the internal ranks. I can tell you one thing that really frustrates also open source people. We find it easier to teach open than to teach political instinct. But yeah, invest in people and skills.
Well, and with that, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very insightful talk. Thank you also for the questions, and sorry for everyone who was not able to ask their questions. If you want to catch Astor or ask questions after the talk, here are the contact details. And Astor wants to thank you for your attention.